here today to discuss two new bridge cameras, the Sony RX10 Mark III and the Panasonic Lumix FZ2500. These are both relatively recent introductions. The Sony came out in March-April of 16. The Lumix came out in September of 16. Actually, a little more recently than that. That was the intro date, not the production date. I think I just got mine just after they came out, and it was closer to November or December. These are both 20 megapixel backside illuminated 1-inch sensors. These 1-inch sensors have come a long way recently, and they very, very closely rival the Micro Four Thirds, and they are very, very close to an APS-C sensor in light gathering ability. And that's really what the sensor is all about. The Sony uses a 24-600 f2.4-4 lens, which is a very long lens and pretty fast for a lens that is that long, 2.4 to f4. That means at 600 millimeters, this is an f4 lens. Comparatively, the Lumix uses a 24-480. It's f2.8 at its wide open, and at 480 it's 4.5. So it's about a half stop behind all the way through. Both cameras are image stabilized and do a good job of that. Sony shoots at 14 frames per second versus 12 frames per second for the Panasonic. They both have 2.4K electronic viewfinders, pretty high resolution viewfinders, very high resolution viewfinders, very excellent. They're both capable of 4K video. The Sony is a little bit heavier at 1,051 grams versus the Lumix's 915. And the Sony comes out at about $1,500 versus $1,200 for the Lumix. Now, as you can see, the cameras are very similar in size. They are relatively bulky for the 1-inch sensor size. If you compare them with some of the small Sony cameras, specifically with the 1-inch sensor, some of them are very small. Even compared to an APS-C DSLR by Nikon, this is the D7100, which uses the same body as the D7200 and is very similar to the new D750, which is full frame. You can see that they aren't much smaller than the full frame or the APS-C would be. However, the advantage of the bridge camera is the lens, the 24-600 to the 24-480, the speed and the size of the lens. This 24-85 is a 3.5 to 4.5, and that's at 85 millimeters. It's 4.5. So you can see that it's a good sized lens, and it only goes to 85 millimeters. This goes to 480 or 600. That's where the real benefit of these cameras are. This bridge camera is an all-you-need camera. You don't need multiple cameras. This covers pretty much the whole range of what you would normally shoot. I have found myself wanting for more wide angle at times. I do like to shoot wide angle. I have been known to take my A6500 with the 10-18, so I have the 15 millimeter as opposed to the 24 millimeter to start with. And I like having 15 millimeters to 24 millimeters for some of my scenics. As you can see, this A6500 APS-C is smaller by a good bit, lighter by a good bit, almost about half. The A6500 will require you to use multiple lenses to achieve anywhere near the flexibility of the solo lens with the FZ2500 or the RX10 Mark III. So you're going to be carrying more different lenses to be able to get anywhere near the versatility of the single lens attached to the camera. This is a mirrorless camera. This is a mirrorless camera. This is an interchangeable lens camera. This one is fixed. This one's permanent. It's not going to come off. You can't replace it. You can't change it. The replaceable lens, the interchangeable lenses, you can put on whatever you want. But you're going to need several lenses to be able to cover the same focal range to get to the 24 to 480 or 24 to 600 in these two bridge cameras. This is the Lumix GX8. Now this has the Micro Four Thirds sensor. As you can see, it too is smaller than both of these cameras. Same problem, you will need to use multiple lenses to be able to get out that far. And even with these lenses, you will see that the maximum and minimum aperture are still going to be this 14 to 45 is 3.5 to 5.6. So that makes that f2.8 to 4.5 look pretty appealing. So how do these do in practice? Well, I've had a lot of fun using both of these cameras. Before I move on, there's one more thing about the Lumix that's particularly interesting that I need to bring up. The Lumix has neutral density filters built in. I hope you can see that. I don't know if you can or not. This is neutral density filters. Now, still frame shooters aren't going to need that much unless you're trying to achieve a blurred effect in the ocean, something like that, where you want a slow shutter speed. But for videographers, this is pretty important. For videographers, you need to have a shutter speed of 50, 60, something like that, which requires a neutral density filter to be able to get your exposure within the range so that you don't blow out everything. So the Lumix is designed for videography much more so than the Sony. And this tends to be a trend with the Panasonic Lumixes. They are very video oriented. They've been very successful in the video field, and they have a lot of video features. So if you're a videographer, giving the need for neutral density filters and using a bridge camera as opposed to a interchangeable lens camera, you probably don't want to lug around a set of neutral density filters. The built-in neutral density filters will make your job much less complex and difficult. The Lumix definitely has an advantage for videographers who use this primarily for videography. The complement of features and sets are pretty similar for both cameras. The Sony has an exposure compensation on top, which I prefer. The Lumix adjusts the shutter and aperture a little more easily for me. Preference for your type of focusing with the little dial on the back, I like. The ISO on a wheel, I like. But each one has a feature sets about it that are good and a couple that are not so good. Mostly it's a matter of getting accustomed to each camera's set of custom features. I do like, especially though, Sony's use of the aperture dial on top, the aperture ring. I really like aperture rings. I wish all of the cameras would use aperture rings on top. That's a personal preference, and I've always praised the Fujis for doing that, and I wish more of them would do that. Lumix does do that on their smaller LX100, and I wish they'd carried it through on this, but it still is very usable without it. If I had to choose between two of these, it would be very difficult. They're both very, very good. If you're shooting primarily for computer output, these are as much as you need and more. They are very practical, very useful. I recently took a hike on these and it started snowing, and I was so glad I had this as opposed to a pack on my back. We had to squeeze through some narrow rocks and stuff, and I was in some slippery terrain, and this did not affect my balance. Having to lug around cameras would have. So this, I was very delighted. I was trying these out at that point in time, and I saw that I definitely in the future have a use for cameras like these when I'm dealing with difficult terrain or possible difficulties, and all I'm going to be doing is posting them on the computer or something like that, and not using them for the cover of a magazine. These are probably 100% of what I need and adequate for 99% of what I do. These are excellent cameras. I'm not going to tell you I prefer one over the other. I will say this, that for videographers, there are some advantages in the audio and video, the neutral density filters. The Sony does a good job too. I do think the Lumix does push towards the videographer a little bit more. So if you're a videographer, take a good look at the feature set on the Lumix versus the Sony. The Sony will probably do what you need, but I think ultimately you're going to be happy with the Lumix in the long term. If you're a still shooter primarily, the 24-600 and the 14 frames per second may be an advantage. The weather sealed definitely is an advantage. If you're willing to pay another $300 for the Sony, for the still shooter, I'd lean to this one maybe just a little bit. But either one will serve you very well, and I really am pleased with both of them. I think that these bridge cameras have come so far, they almost negate the need for a interchangeable lens camera for a lot of my touring needs and general around town use. So pick either one of them. I think you're going to be very happy. Thanks for joining me.